Owen Carter, the CEO of a billion-dollar tech conglomerate, stood at the pinnacle of success, his name synonymous with innovation and power. At 35, he had built an empire from the ground up, his company Nexus Technologies dominating the global market for AI-driven solutions. Yet for all his achievements, Owen knew that public perception could make or break a man in his position. The world didn't just want a brilliant mind. It demanded a relatable figure, a leader with a heart. That's where Avista Gross came in. Avista was the perfect counterpart to Owen's carefully curated image. At 28, she was a rising star in her own right, a data scientist with a PhD from MIT, and a reputation for quiet brilliance. Her sharp intellect was matched only by her discretion, a quality Owen valued above all else. She could navigate a room full of sharks without making a ripple, her calm demeanor and understated elegance disarming even the most cynical reporters. To the world, she was the ideal partner for a man like Owen, proof that he was more than a ruthless businessman. To Owen, she was a strategic asset, the final piece in his campaign to become the compassionate CEO the public adored. Their wedding was a spectacle, meticulously planned to project warmth and authenticity. Held in a sprawling vineyard in Napa Valley, the event was a masterclass in optics. The guest list read like a who's who of tech moguls, political figures, and philanthropists, all mingling under a canopy of twinkling lights. Avista's ivory gown, designed by a sustainable fashion house, was praised in every lifestyle blog as elegant yet approachable. Owen, in a tailored navy suit, played the part of the devoted groom flawlessly, his smile practiced but convincing. The press ate it up, churning out headlines like "Tech Titan Ties the Knot" in heartwarming ceremony, and Owen Carter's love story, a new chapter for Nexus. Avista, however, wasn't acting. Her love for Owen was real, a fire that burned deep within her. She had fallen for him 2 years earlier, when they met at a conference in Singapore. He had been a keynote speaker, his charisma filling the room as he spoke about technology's potential to change lives. Offstage, he was quieter, almost introspective, and it was in those moments that Avista saw a man she could love. She believed in his vision, not just for Nexus, but for a better world. When he proposed 6 months later on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline, she said yes without hesitation, her heart soaring at the thought of building a life with him. Owen's proposal, though, was less about love and more about timing. Nexus was on the cusp of a major IPO, and the board had been clear: a stable, relatable image would boost investor confidence. Avista was the key. She wasn't just intelligent and poised. She was scandal-proof. Her modest upbringing in a small Oregon town made her the perfect foil to Owen's privileged background. She had no skeletons in her closet, no messy exes or controversial opinions. Marrying her would cement his reputation as a grounded, forward-thinking leader. The ring, a 5-carat emerald set in recycled gold, was chosen not for sentiment, but for its eco-conscious message, another nod to the values Owen publicly championed. In the months leading up to the wedding, Avista threw herself into their shared life. She moved into Owen's sleek Manhattan penthouse, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that never slept. She adapted to his world, attending galas and board meetings, always at his side with a warm smile and a clever quip to diffuse tension. She didn't mind the spotlight. She saw it as a chance to amplify causes she cared about, like education and digital literacy. Owen encouraged her advocacy, not out of genuine support, but because it aligned with his brand. "Keep doing what you do," he'd say, his tone casual, but calculated. "It's good for us." Avista mistook his encouragement for affection. She saw his late-night strategy sessions and endless phone calls as signs of a man passionate about his work, not a man orchestrating every detail of his life, including her. She didn't notice how he steered conversations away from personal topics, how he deflected questions about their future with a charming laugh and a vague promise of someday. To her, their relationship was a partnership, a shared journey towards something meaningful. To Owen, it was a chess game, and Avista was his queen, valuable, but ultimately a piece to be moved. The wedding day itself was flawless. Avista walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on Owen, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and joy. She had written her own vows, pouring her soul into every word. "Owen, you are my compass, my safe harbor," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears in her eyes. "I promise to stand by you, to challenge you, to love you through every storm." The crowd sighed, moved by her sincerity. Owen's vows were equally eloquent, crafted by a speechwriter to strike the perfect balance of warmth and gravitas. "Avista, you make me better," he said, his gaze steady. "With you, I am home." The words were beautiful, but to him, they were just another line delivered with precision. As they danced their first dance to a soft acoustic cover of a classic love song, Avista rested her head against Owen's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. She believed they were building something real, something lasting. Owen, meanwhile, scanned the room, noting the approving nods of investors and the flashes of cameras capturing the moment. Everything was going according to plan. In the weeks that followed, the newlyweds settled into a routine that looked idyllic from the outside. Avista continued her work at Nexus, leading a team developing AI tools for underserved communities. Owen praised her publicly, calling her the heart of our mission in interviews. Behind closed doors, though, he kept his distance. He was affectionate enough to maintain the illusion, holding her hand at events, kissing her cheek for the cameras. But there was a coolness to his touch, a detachment Avista couldn't quite place. She chalked it up to stress, to the weight of running a company on the verge of global domination. What Avista didn't know was that Owen had already mapped out the next phase of his strategy. The IPO was just the beginning. He had his sights set on a merger that would make Nexus untouchable. Every move he made, including his marriage, was a step toward that goal. Avista's love was a bonus, a pleasant side effect of a decision that served his ambitions. He didn't dislike her, far from it. He admired her intellect, her grace, her ability to make him look good. But love, that was a variable he couldn't control. And Owen Carter didn't believe in leaving anything to chance. As the months passed, Avista began to sense the cracks in their fairy tale. Owen's late nights grew longer, his smiles more perfunctory. She told herself it was temporary, that he was under pressure. She didn't know that to Owen, she was a means to an end, a carefully chosen piece in his grand design. And when the first real test of their marriage came, it would shatter her illusions and her heart in ways she could never have imagined. Avista Gross stood in the bathroom of their Manhattan penthouse, staring at the 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test. Her hands trembled as she gripped the counter, a wave of joy crashing over her. A baby. Their baby. She imagined a tiny life growing inside her, a piece of her and Owen intertwined forever. For a moment, the world felt brighter, the sterile luxury of their apartment softened by the warmth of possibility. She pictured telling Owen, his face lighting up his arms, pulling her close. They would be a family, a real one, not just the polished image they presented to the world. Avista had always wanted children, though she'd kept the dream tucked away during their whirlwind courtship and marriage. Owen's life was a high-stakes chess game, every move calculated for maximum impact. She'd assumed they'd talk about it later, when Nexus Technologies' IPO was finalized and the pressure eased. But now, the future was here, real and beating inside her. She placed a hand on her stomach, a smile breaking through her nerves. Surely Owen would feel the same joy she did. He had to. That evening, Avista waited for Owen to return from a late board meeting. The penthouse was quiet, save for the hum of the city beyond the windows. She'd lit candles, set out his favorite wine, and rehearsed her words 100 times. When the door finally opened, Owen stepped in, his suit slightly rumpled, his eyes tired, but sharp. "Long day," he muttered, loosening his tie. "The board's breathing down my neck about the merger." Avista took a deep breath, her heart racing. "Owen, I have something to tell you." She guided him to the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm pregnant." The air seemed to freeze. Owen's expression didn't shift immediately, but his eyes narrowed, a flicker of something cold passing through them. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Pregnant," he repeated as if testing the word. "How far along?" "About 6 weeks," Avista said, her voice soft, but hopeful. "I know it's unexpected, but I'm happy, Owen. Really happy." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood pacing to the window, his silhouette framed against the glittering skyline. Avista watched him, waiting for a smile, a touch, anything to mirror her excitement. But when he turned back, his face was a mask of control, his jaw tight. "This isn't good timing, Avista," he said, his tone clipped. "The merger with Apex Corp is on a knife's edge. Investors are skittish. A pregnancy announcement could tank the deal." Avista's heart sank, but she clung to optimism. "We don't have to announce it yet. We can keep it private, just between us, until things settle." Owen shook his head, his voice hardening. "It's not just about the announcement. A baby changes everything. The board will see it as a distraction, a liability. They're already questioning my focus." He paused, his gaze piercing. "We can't have this right now." The words hit like a slap. Avista's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to be practical," Owen replied, his tone devoid of warmth. "This merger is worth $10 billion. It's the future of Nexus. A child complicates things. You need to take care of it." "Take care of it?" Avista's voice trembled, disbelief rising like bile. "You mean you want me to—" "Yes," Owen cut in, his eyes unyielding. "It's the only way. We'll have time for kids later when the company's secure. Right now, we can't afford this." Avista felt her world tilt. The man she loved, the man she'd vowed to stand by, was asking her to erase the life they'd created together. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, protective, defiant. "Owen, this is our child," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "How can you say that? Don't make this emotional." He snapped, his patience fraying. "This is about survival. Nexus is bigger than us, bigger than any one person. You know that. You've always understood the bigger picture." Avista stared at him, searching for the man she thought she knew. The one who'd held her hand at galas, who'd called her his home in front of 1,000 guests. But all she saw now was a stranger, his priorities laid bare. The room felt smaller, the candlelight mocking her earlier hopes. "You're asking me to choose between our child and your company?" she said, her voice breaking. "I'm asking you to choose us." Owen countered, stepping closer, his tone softening, but not enough to mask the steel beneath. "Our life, our future. A baby now could ruin everything we've built." "You're smart, Avista. You know I'm right." She wanted to scream, to throw the wine bottle at the wall, to shake him until he felt the same love, the same fierce protectiveness she did. But years of keeping her composure, of being the perfect partner, held her back. She nodded slowly, her face a mask of compliance. Okay. She whispered the word, tasting like ash. I'll take care of it. Owen exhaled relief, flickering across his face. Good. I knew you'd understand. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her skin crawling at his touch. He didn't notice already turning to his phone, scrolling through emails, as if the conversation had been a minor inconvenience. That night, Avista lay awake, her hand resting on her stomach. The city's hum was a distant roar, drowned out by the storm in her heart. She thought of her mother, who'd raised her alone in a small Oregon town, sacrificing everything for her daughter. She thought of the tiny heartbeat inside her, a life that deserved a chance. Owen's words echoed practical survival. Bigger picture, but they couldn't erase the truth. This was her child, not a liability to be erased. In the days that followed, Avista went through the motions. She scheduled an appointment at a clinic, let Owen believe she was following through. But in the quiet of her office at Nexus, she made a different choice. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't. The love she felt for her unborn child was fiercer than her love for Owen, fiercer than the life they'd built together. She began to plan in secret, her mind racing with possibilities. She could leave, start over somewhere new, protect her baby from a man who saw it as a threat. Owen, oblivious, continued his campaign for the merger. He was charming in public, praising Avista's work, in interviews, holding her hand at events. But the distance between them grew, a chasm Avista no longer tried to bridge. She smiled for the cameras, played the role of the devoted wife. But inside, she was breaking. Her heart was a mosaic of shattered pieces held together only by the promise of the life growing within her. As the merger negotiations intensified, Owen's focus narrowed to a pinpoint. He didn't notice Avista's quiet withdrawal, the way her laughter no longer reached her eyes. He didn't see the suitcase she packed in secret, the bank account she opened under a new name. Avista knew what she had to do, even if it meant leaving everything behind. The invisible hand of Owen's ambition had crushed her joy, but it wouldn't touch her child. She would protect this life, no matter the cost. The divorce was finalized in a sterile conference room on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan law firm, far from the glittering spotlight of Owen Carter's world. The mahogany table gleamed under fluorescent lights, its surface reflecting the faces of two people who had once vowed to love each other forever. Avista Gross sat across from Owen, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a simple gray blazer, her face devoid of makeup, her eyes hollow, but resolute. Owen, impeccable, in a tailored charcoal suit, signed the papers with a flourish, his expression unreadable. There were no raised voices, no tears, no dramatic outbursts, only the quiet scratch of pens on paper and the soft murmur of their lawyers finalizing details. Avista had insisted on discretion, and Owen, ever the strategist, agreed. A public divorce would invite scrutiny, questions about the perfect marriage that had bolstered his image as the compassionate CEO of Nexus Technologies. Instead, they crafted a careful narrative, a mutual parting, amicable and private, with no details to feed the tabloids. The settlement was generous. Avista would receive a substantial sum, enough to start over anywhere she chose, but it came with a non-disclosure agreement. She was to remain silent about their marriage, their life, and the reasons it ended. Avista signed without hesitation, her signature a final act of compliance in a role she no longer wanted to play. To the outside world, Avista Gross simply vanished. The press, hungry for a story, spun tales of her mysterious disappearance from Owen's side. Headlines speculated wildly. Where is Avista Carter? Tech CEO's wife goes off-grid and Nexus power couple splits. What's behind the silence? Social media buzzed with theories. Some claimed she'd left for a spiritual retreat. Others whispered of a scandal Owen had paid to bury. The truth, of course, was simpler and far more painful. Avista had walked away to protect the child Owen believed she'd terminated. Owen was certain Avista had followed through on his demand to take care of the pregnancy. She'd gone to the clinic appointment, returned home pale and quiet, and never mentioned the baby again. He took her silence as confirmation, her withdrawal as grief she'd eventually overcome. He didn't ask questions, didn't press for details. To him, the matter was closed, a necessary sacrifice for the $10 billion merger with Apex Corp that now consumed his every waking moment. The deal was his legacy, the crowning achievement of his career, and he couldn't afford distractions, not even the woman who had once been his perfect partner. Avista's departure was a relief in a way. Owen had grown uneasy with her presence, the way her eyes seemed to see through him in the final weeks of their marriage. Her laughter, once a balm to his stress, had faded, replaced by a quiet intensity that unnerved him. He told himself it was for the best. She'd move on, find a new life, and he could focus on Nexus without the weight of personal complications. He didn't hate her, far from it. He admired her strength, her ability to slip away without causing a scene. But love, that had never been part of the equation, not for him. In the days after the divorce, Owen threw himself into work with renewed vigor. The merger negotiations were at a critical stage, and he spent 16-hour days in boardrooms, charming investors and outmaneuvering rivals. His team marveled at his focus, his ability to compartmentalize. Carter's a machine, one executive whispered, half in awe. At night, alone in the penthouse that still carried traces of Avista's presence. A forgotten scarf, a book on the shelf, Owen felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. Not regret, not yet, but a hollowness that lingered like a bruise. Avista, meanwhile, was already gone. She'd left New York the day after the papers were signed, her belongings packed into a single suitcase. She didn't take the designer dresses or the jewelry Owen had gifted her for appearances. Instead, she carried a few essentials and the secret growing inside her. She boarded a flight to New Mexico, her destination a small town where her grandmother lived, a place far from the flashing cameras and corporate games. She used a new name, one untainted by the Carter legacy, and began rebuilding her life with a quiet determination. The media frenzy faded quickly, as it always does. Owen's PR team worked overtime to shift the narrative, highlighting his latest charitable initiatives and the impending merger. Avista's absence was explained away as a personal journey, a vague phrase that satisfied most reporters. The public moved on, distracted by the next big story, and Owen believed he'd closed the chapter cleanly. He didn't know that Avista was carrying their child, that she'd chosen to protect it over the life they'd built together. He didn't know that her silence wasn't surrender, but defiance, a refusal to let his ambition erase the one thing that mattered most to her. In the weeks that followed, Owen's life returned to its relentless rhythm. He traveled between New York, London, and Singapore, sealing deals and shaking hands with men who saw him as untouchable. His smiles were sharper now, his charm more polished, but there was a new edge to him, a coldness that even his closest allies noticed. He didn't speak of Avista, didn't acknowledge the empty space she'd left. To him, she was a footnote, a chapter closed, to make way for greater things. Avista, in her new life, found solace in simplicity. She rented a small apartment above a bookstore in New Mexico, its walls lined with faded wallpaper and memories of her childhood visits. Her grandmother, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, welcomed her without questions, sensing the weight of what Avista carried. Avista spent her days sketching plans for a digital marketing startup, a venture small enough to stay under the radar, but meaningful enough to keep her mind sharp. She avoided the internet, steering clear of news about Nexus or Owen. Her world was her own now, centered on the life growing inside her. The divorce had been cold, clinical, a transaction, as calculated as their marriage had been. But for Avista, it was liberation. She was no longer the perfect wife, the strategic asset. She was a woman, reclaiming her future one step at a time. Owen, oblivious to the truth, moved forward with the certainty of a man who believed he controlled everything. He didn't know that the child he thought was gone was still alive, a secret that would one day unravel his carefully constructed world. As winter settled over New York, Owen stood at his penthouse window, staring at the city below. The merger was on track, his empire growing stronger by the day. Yet the hollowness persisted, a quiet ache he couldn't shake. He told himself it was exhaustion, the price of ambition. But deep down, in a place he refused to acknowledge, he wondered if he'd lost something irreplaceable. Avista was gone, and with her, a piece of the man he might have been. The divorce was finalized in a hushed, sterile conference room on the 50th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, far from the prying eyes of the world Owen Carter had mastered. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee, its long glass table reflecting the cold fluorescence of overhead lights. Avista sat at one end, her posture straight but fragile, her hands clasped tightly to still their trembling. She wore a simple black dress, her face bare of makeup, her dark eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Across from her, Owen, the celebrated CEO of Nexus Technologies, signed the papers with a practiced flick of his wrist. His face as unreadable as the contracts he'd built his empire on. There were no arguments, no tearful pleas, only the soft rustle of legal documents and the murmured assurances of their lawyers. Avista had insisted on silence, and Owen, ever the pragmatist, agreed. A public divorce would unravel the carefully crafted image of the compassionate CEO he'd spent years perfecting. The press would swarm, investors would question his stability, and the $10 billion merger with Apex Corp, his crowning achievement, could falter. So they orchestrated a quiet exit. No press releases, no public statements, just a mutual agreement to part ways. Avista would receive a generous settlement, enough to vanish comfortably, but it came with a non-disclosure agreement. She was to say nothing about their marriage, their life, or the reasons it crumbled. Avista signed without a word, her signature a final surrender to a role she could no longer bear. To the world, Avista simply disappeared. The media, always eager for a mystery, spun tales of her absence. Avista Carter vanishes from tech titan's life, blared one headline. What happened to Nexus's golden couple, asked another. Social media churned with speculation. Some said she'd fled to a wellness retreat in Bali. Others whispered of a secret affair or a breakdown Owen had paid to conceal. The truth was simpler, rawer. Avista had left to protect the child Owen believed she'd erased from existence. Owen was convinced Avista had followed his cold directive to take care of the pregnancy. She'd gone to the clinic, returned home pale and silent, and never spoke of it again. To him, her quietness was proof, her withdrawal, a sign she'd moved on. He didn't ask for details, didn't want to know. The matter was closed, a necessary sacrifice for the merger that would cement Nexus's dominance. He buried any flicker of guilt beneath boardroom strategies and late-night calls, telling himself it was for the greater good. Avista's role in his life had been fulfilled. She'd played the perfect wife, and now she was gone, leaving him free to focus on his empire. Avista's departure suited Owen's needs. Her presence had grown heavy in their final weeks together, her once warm gaze replaced by something he couldn't decipher. Hurt, perhaps, or defiance. It unsettled him, though he'd never admit it. Her exit was clean, efficient, like a deal closed without complications. He didn't hate her. He respected her ability to slip away without causing a scene. But love. That had never been part of his calculus. Avista had been a strategic asset, a piece of his carefully constructed image, and with her gone, he could move forward, unencumbered. In the days after the divorce, Owen dove deeper into his work. The merger was at a critical juncture, and he spent hours in glass-walled offices, charming investors and outmaneuvering competitors. His team admired his focus, calling him relentless, with a mix of awe and fear. At night, in the sprawling penthouse that still held traces of Avista, a forgotten scarf on a chair, a book of poetry on the shelf, Owen felt a strange emptiness. He dismissed it as fatigue, the cost of ambition. The merger was his legacy, and nothing, not even the ghost of his marriage, could distract him. Avista, meanwhile, was already rebuilding her life. She'd left New York the morning after the divorce, her belongings packed into a single duffel bag. She took none of the designer clothes or jewelry Owen had gifted her for appearances. All she carried was a few essentials, and the secret growing inside her, a child she'd vowed to protect. She boarded a bus to New Mexico, heading for the small desert town where her grandmother lived, a place untouched by the chaos of Owen's world. Under a new name, she began to carve out a future one where her child would know love, not ambition. The media storm around Avista's disappearance faded quickly. Owen's PR team worked tirelessly, redirecting attention to his latest initiatives, a charity fund for digital literacy, a new AI breakthrough at Nexus. Avista's absence was explained as a personal choice, a vague phrase that satisfied most reporters. The public moved on, distracted by fresh scandals, and Owen believed he'd escaped unscathed. He didn't know that Avista was still pregnant, that she'd chosen her child over the life he'd offered. He didn't know her silence was not compliance, but a quiet rebellion against his control. In New Mexico, Avista found refuge in simplicity. Her grandmother's small adobe house smelled of sage and old wood, its walls lined with family photos and woven blankets. The older woman asked no questions, sensing the weight of Avista's pain. Avista spent her days planning a small digital marketing startup, something to keep her mind sharp and her heart steady. She avoided news of Nexus, of Owen, of the world she'd left behind. Her focus was singular, her child, the heartbeat she felt in quiet moments, the promise of a new beginning. The divorce had been cold, transactional, a mirror of the marriage it ended. For Avista, it was freedom. She was no longer Owen's perfect wife, no longer a prop in his grand narrative. She was a woman reclaiming her life, her choices, her love. Owen, oblivious to the truth, marched forward with the certainty of a man who believed he'd won. He thought Avista had erased their child, severed their past. He didn't know that the life he'd dismissed was still growing a secret that would one day shatter his carefully built world. As winter blanketed New York, Owen stood at his penthouse window, the city's lights sprawling below like a map of his conquests. The merger was on track, his empire stronger than ever. Yet, the emptiness lingered, a quiet ache he couldn't name. He told himself it was the price of greatness, the toll of leading a company that shaped the future. But in the stillness of the night, when the city's hum faded, he felt the weight of what he'd lost, not just Avista, but something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. For now, he pushed it aside, focusing on the next meeting, the next deal. The future was his to command, and Avista was gone, a chapter closed. Or so he thought. Avista stepped off the Greyhound bus in Taos, New Mexico, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, the desert air sharp and cool against her skin. The sun hung low, painting the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in hues of amber and crimson. She was a world away from the steel and glass of Manhattan, from the life she'd left behind with Owen Carter. At 28, she was starting over her identity, reduced to a new name, Elena Ruiz, and a secret she guarded with fierce resolve, the child growing inside her. The divorce papers were barely dry, but Avista felt lighter, unburdened by the weight of being Owen's perfect wife. Here, in the quiet of her grandmother's town, she could be herself again. The bus station was little more than a dusty lot with a single bench, but Avista's grandmother, Rosa, was waiting. At 72, Rosa was a force of nature, her silver hair braided tightly, her eyes sharp enough to cut through any lie. She didn't ask about New York, or Owen didn't mention the headlines speculating about Avista's disappearance. Instead, she pulled Avista into a hug, her arms strong and warm, and whispered, "You're home now, mija." Avista clung to her, the first tears since the divorce spilling silently down her cheeks. Rosa's adobe house, tucked at the edge of town, became Avista's sanctuary. Its walls, thick with history, smelled of sage and cedar, and its small rooms were filled with memories of childhood summers. Days spent weaving with Rosa, learning the names of desert plants and listening to stories of resilience. Avista's pregnancy was her greatest secret, one she shared only with Rosa. In New York, she'd played the part of the compliant wife, letting Owen believe she'd followed his cold demand to terminate the pregnancy. But here, in the quiet of Taos, she felt the flutter of life within her, a reminder that she'd chosen her child over his ambition. She wore loose sweaters to conceal her growing belly, not out of shame, but to protect her peace. The world didn't need to know, not yet. Her focus was on survival, on building a life where her child could thrive far from the cameras and boardrooms that had defined her marriage. Under her new name, Elena Ruiz Avista began to carve out a place for herself. She rented a small apartment above a bookstore in the heart of Taos, its creaky wooden floors and mismatched furniture, a stark contrast to Owen's sleek penthouse. The space was hers, paid for with the modest savings she'd squirreled away before leaving New York. Rosa helped her settle in, bringing blankets and homemade tamales, her presence a steady anchor. Avista spent her days sketching plans for a digital marketing startup, something small but meaningful. She'd always been brilliant at data, at crafting narratives that resonated. Now she would use those skills to build something of her own, free from Owen's shadow. The startup, called Soul Digital, was born in a cramped corner of her apartment with a second-hand laptop and a single client, a local pottery shop, looking to boost its online presence. Avista threw herself into the work, designing campaigns, analyzing metrics, and teaching herself the nuances of small business marketing. It was a far cry from the high-stakes projects at Nexus Technologies, but it felt honest, grounded. She worked late into the night, her desk lit by a single lamp, her hand occasionally resting on her stomach, as if to reassure the life inside her. Soul Digital grew slowly, picking up clients, a cafe, a yoga studio, a weaver's cooperative. Avista's reputation as Elena spread quietly, her talent speaking louder than any press release. Taos was a town that respected privacy, and Avista blended in effortlessly. She shopped at the farmer's market, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, her face free of the makeup she'd worn for Owen's world. Locals knew her as Elena, the quiet woman with a knack for marketing, and they didn't pry. Rosa, ever protective, deflected questions from curious neighbors with a sharp glance or a quick change of subject. Avista's pregnancy remained hidden, her loose clothing and the town's discretion shielding her from scrutiny. She avoided the internet, steering clear of news about Nexus or Owen. The headlines about her disappearance had faded, replaced by stories of Owen's latest triumphs. To the world, Avista Carter was gone, a footnote in the saga of a tech titan. In the stillness of her new life, Avista found moments of peace. She walked the desert trails with Rosa, the crunch of gravel underfoot grounding her. She learned to cook her grandmother's recipes, chile rellenos pozole, each dish a tether to her roots. Her pregnancy progressed quietly, marked by small milestones: the first kick, the curve of her belly under her palm, the soft hum of lullabies she sang when no one was listening. Rosa watched her with pride, never pushing for details but offering wisdom in quiet moments. "You're stronger than you know," she'd say, her voice steady. "You always have been." Yet even in Taos, the past lingered. Avista would sometimes wake in the night, her heart racing, Owen's cold words echoing in her mind. "Take care of it." She'd lie there, hand on her stomach, reminding herself that she'd made the right choice. Leaving New York had been an act of defiance, a refusal to let his ambition erase her child. But the pain of his betrayal still cut deep. She'd loved him, believed in him, and he'd seen her as nothing more than a means to an end. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a betrayal of the life they could have had, the family she'd dreamed of. As winter approached, Avista's belly grew, and she began to prepare for the future. She met with a midwife in secret, a kind woman who asked no questions about her past. She saved every penny from Sol Digital planning for the day her child would arrive. The startup was modest, but promising, its client base growing through word of mouth. Avista found purpose in the work, in helping small businesses thrive in a world dominated by giants like Nexus. It was her rebellion, quiet but fierce, against the life Owen had tried to define for her. In New York, Owen moved forward oblivious to the truth. He believed Avista had followed his orders, that their marriage and its complications were neatly resolved. The merger with Apex Corp was on track, his empire expanding, his image untarnished. He didn't know that Avista was building a new life, that the child he'd dismissed was growing stronger each day. He didn't know that her disappearance was not an end, but a beginning. Avista stood on the porch of Rosa's house one evening, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of piñón. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling a gentle kick, and smiled. She was no longer Avista Carter, the perfect wife of a tech titan. She was Elena Ruiz, a woman who had vanished to save herself and her child. In the quiet of Taos, she was finding her strength, her purpose, her home. Owen Carter stood at the pinnacle of his empire, but the view was no longer exhilarating. The CEO of Nexus Technologies, once celebrated as a visionary, was unraveling. The $10 billion merger with Apex Corp had gone through, cementing his legacy as a titan of industry, but the victory felt hollow. In the months since Avista's quiet departure from his life, Owen had grown colder, his charm replaced by a brittle edge that even his closest allies noticed. The boardroom, once his domain, now felt like a battlefield, where every decision carried the weight of unseen consequences. Scandals once deftly avoided began to circle like vultures, and Owen, for the first time in years, felt the ground shifting beneath him. Nexus was in turmoil. A data breach exposed by a whistleblower had sparked a media firestorm. Headlines screamed of negligence. Nexus Technologies compromised, user data at risk, and Carter's empire crumbles amid privacy scandal. The press, once enamored with Owen's polished image, turned on him, digging for dirt. Rumors swirled about his personal life, with some outlets revisiting Avista's disappearance and spinning conspiracies about what the CEO might be hiding. Owen's PR team worked overtime, issuing statements and deflecting questions, but the damage was done. Investors were jittery, and the board began to whisper about his leadership. "He's distracted," one director muttered, during a closed-door meeting. "He's not the same Carter." Owen felt the pressure like a vice. He spent days in crisis mode, meeting with lawyers, strategizing with his team, and delivering carefully scripted apologies to the public. His nights, however, were another story. Sleep eluded him, his Manhattan penthouse, a silent prison. The sleek furniture, the city skyline beyond the windows, the awards lining his shelves, all felt like relics of a life that no longer fit. He'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, the silence broken only by the hum of the city below. When sleep did come, it brought nightmares. A faceless child, small and fragile, reaching for him in a void. The dreams were vivid, relentless, each one leaving him gasping, his heart pounding with a guilt he couldn't name. He told himself it was stress, the merger, the scandal, the endless demands of Nexus. They were enough to fray anyone's nerves. But deep down, Owen knew better. The child in his dreams was the one he'd told Avista to take care of, the one he'd dismissed as a liability. He'd believed she'd followed through, that she'd gone to the clinic and ended the pregnancy to protect his ambitions. Her silence in those final weeks, her pale face and averted eyes, had seemed like confirmation. But now, in the dark of his sleepless nights, doubt crept in. Had she? He hadn't asked, hadn't wanted to know. The possibility that she hadn't, that a piece of him was out there, haunted him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Owen's days were a performance. He strode into boardrooms with the same commanding presence, his suits impeccable, his voice steady. But his team noticed the changes, the way his hands trembled slightly when he poured coffee, the way his laughter no longer reached his eyes. He snapped at assistants over minor errors, his patience worn thin. Once, during a heated meeting, he froze mid-sentence, staring at nothing, before recovering with a forced smile. "Carter's losing it," a junior executive whispered later, unaware that Owen had overheard. The words stung, but he couldn't argue. He was losing something: control, certainty, himself. The scandal grew worse. A second whistleblower emerged, alleging Nexus had knowingly ignored security flaws to rush the merger. The stock plummeted, and Owen's face was plastered across every news outlet, his once golden reputation tarnished. He hired a crisis management firm, sat through endless interviews, and donated millions to cybersecurity initiatives. But the public's trust was eroding. Social media was merciless, with hashtags like #CarterFail trending. Amid the chaos, Avista's absence loomed larger. She'd been his shield, her quiet intelligence and grace, diffusing tensions he hadn't even noticed. Without her, he was exposed, vulnerable, in ways he hadn't anticipated. Owen tried to fill the void. He dated briefly a model-turned-entrepreneur who looked good on his arm, but the relationship fizzled in weeks. She was too eager for the spotlight, too unlike Avista's understated strength. He threw himself into philanthropy, funding schools and tech programs, but the gestures felt empty, a desperate attempt to reclaim the compassionate CEO image. Nothing worked. The hollowness grew, a constant ache that no amount of work or whiskey could dull. One night, after a particularly brutal day, Owen found himself in Avista's old office at Nexus. It had been repurposed, but traces of her remained: a notebook with her precise handwriting, a photo of her at a company event, smiling softly. He sat at the desk, the notebook open in front of him, and traced her words with his finger. They were notes for a project she'd led, something about digital literacy for underserved communities. He hadn't paid attention then, too focused on his own goals. Now, the words felt like a reproach, a reminder of the woman he'd pushed away. The dreams grew worse. The child's face began to take shape, dark eyes like Avista's, a small hand reaching out. Owen would wake, sweating his chest tight. The image burned into his mind. He started avoiding sleep, working through the night, his office lit by the glow of his laptop. He searched for Avista online, something he hadn't done since the divorce. There was nothing, no social media, no news, just the fading echoes of her disappearance. He wondered where she was, what she was doing, whether she hated him. The thought that she might be out there raising their child alone was a possibility he couldn't face. Not yet. Nexus's troubles deepened. A key investor pulled out, citing leadership concerns. The board called an emergency meeting, and Owen faced pointed questions about his judgment. He deflected with charm, but it was wearing thin. "We need you focused," Carter, the chairman, said, his tone sharp. Owen nodded, promising results, but inside he was fraying. The man who'd once controlled every variable was losing his grip, and the world was noticing. In the quiet of his penthouse, Owen stood at the window, the city sprawling below like a map of his triumphs and failures. He thought of Avista, of the life they'd built, of the child he'd told her to erase. The dreams were no longer just dreams. They were a reckoning. He didn't know if the child existed, but the possibility was enough to crack the armor he'd worn for years. For the first time, Owen felt the weight of his choices, not as a CEO, but as a man. The empire he'd built was crumbling, and the hollowness inside him was no longer just an ache. It was regret, sharp and unyielding, for the woman and the life he'd let slip away. Owen Carter stepped out of the black SUV, the dry heat of Santa Fe hitting him like a wave. The city was a stark contrast to his usual haunts. New York's gleaming towers, replaced by low-slung adobe buildings, the air thick with the scent of piñon and dust. He was in New Mexico for a tech conference, a last-minute trip to salvage Nexus Technologies' reputation after the data breach scandal. His team had booked him into a boutique hotel near the plaza, and he'd planned to spend the day preparing for a keynote speech. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It was late afternoon when Owen decided to clear his head with a walk. The conference was draining, filled with skeptical investors and probing journalists. He needed a moment away from the chaos, away from the nightmares that had plagued him since Avista's departure. He wandered the narrow streets of Santa Fe, his polished loafers out of place on the uneven sidewalks. The town buzzed with quiet energy, artists selling turquoise jewelry, tourists snapping photos of the historic palace of the governors. Owen barely noticed his mind replaying the same questions. Where was Avista? Was she safe? Had she really ended their child's life as he'd assumed? He turned a corner onto a side street lined with small shops, their windows displaying pottery and woven blankets. That's when he saw her. Avista. She stepped out of a corner store, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her dark hair loose and catching the sunlight. Her belly was round, unmistakable, the gentle curve of pregnancy, visible even under her loose sweater. Owen froze his breath, catching in his throat. The world tilted, the sounds of the street fading to a dull roar. She was pregnant. She hadn't followed through. The child he'd thought was gone, the child he'd told her to take care of, was alive, growing inside her. Avista didn't see him. She paused outside the store, adjusting her bag, her face serene but tired. She looked different, freer somehow, without the weight of New York's expectations. Her skin glowed in the desert light, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she carried not just a child, but a new life entirely. Owen's heart pounded, a mix of shock and something deeper, guilt, longing, a realization that crashed over him like a wave. He'd been wrong. All this time he'd believed she'd complied, that she'd erased their child to protect his ambitions. But Avista had chosen differently, and in that moment, Owen saw the depth of his mistake. He took a step forward, then stopped. What could he say? He'd driven her away, demanded she sacrifice their child for his empire. The memory of their last conversation burned his cold words, her shattered expression. He'd thought he was in control, that he'd closed that chapter cleanly. Now, seeing her, he felt the ground crumble beneath him. His empire, his success, his carefully curated image, it all meant nothing against the reality of Avista, alive and pregnant, building a life without him. Owen's mind raced. How long had she been here? Why Santa Fe? He remembered her mentioning a grandmother in New Mexico, a fleeting detail from their early days when he'd still listened to her stories. Had she come here to hide, to protect their child from him? The thought stung sharper than any boardroom defeat. He wanted to call out to her to cross the street and demand answers, but his feet wouldn't move. He was a stranger to her now, a man who'd betrayed her trust. Avista turned her profile, catching the light, and for a moment, Owen thought she'd seen him. But her gaze passed over him unfocused, and she started walking down the street, her steps steady but slow. He watched her go, his chest tight, with a pain he couldn't name. The dreams that had haunted him, the faceless child reaching out, flashed through his mind. They weren't just dreams anymore. They were real, and they were here, carried by the woman he'd let slip away. He followed her at a distance, his instincts overriding his hesitation. She moved through the plaza, stopping to browse a stall of handmade scarves. Owen kept to the shadows, his tailored coat and city demeanor drawing curious glances from locals. He didn't care. All he could see was Avista, her quiet strength, the life she carried. He wondered what she called herself now. Surely not Avista Carter. She'd erased his name as surely as he'd tried to erase their child. The irony was bitter, cutting deeper than he expected. Avista entered a small cafe, its windows steamed from the warmth inside. Owen stopped across the street, his breath visible in the cooling air. He could go in, confront her demand, to know why she hadn't told him. But what right did he have? He'd made his choice, and she'd made hers. The realization hit him like a blow. Avista wasn't hiding from the world. She was hiding from him. And he deserved it. He stood there, rooted as minutes turned to an hour. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the plaza. Avista emerged from the cafe, a paper cup in her hand, her face lit by a small smile as she spoke to an older woman beside her. Owen's heart lurched. The woman had to be her grandmother. Silver hair, sharp eyes, a protective hand on Avista's arm. They walked together, disappearing around a corner, and Owen felt the weight of his isolation. He was alone, a stranger, in a town that had welcomed the woman he'd lost. The conference, the merger, the scandals, they all seemed trivial now. Owen's world had been built on control, on calculated moves, but Avista's pregnancy was a variable he hadn't anticipated. It changed everything. He thought of the child in his dreams, no longer faceless, but real, a part of him, and Avista that he'd tried to erase. The guilt was suffocating, a tidal wave that threatened to drown him. He'd been wrong about Avista, about himself, about what mattered. Owen returned to his hotel, the keynote speech forgotten. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, replaying the moment he'd seen her. Avista was alive, thriving, carrying their child. He didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. He'd lost her once, driven her away with his ambition. Now, seeing her in Santa Fe, pregnant and unbroken, he knew he had to try to make amends, to face the man he'd become. The world he'd built was crumbling, but for the first time, Owen felt a spark of something new. Not control, but hope. Owen Carter's world had shifted irrevocably the moment he saw Avista in Santa Fe, her pregnant belly a living rebuke to the choices he'd made. The image haunted him, her quiet strength, the curve of her silhouette against the desert sun, the life she carried that he'd once dismissed. Back in his hotel room, the weight of his actions pressed down heavier than any boardroom defeat. The merger, the scandals, the empire he'd built, they all paled against the truth. Avista had kept their child, defying his cold demand to end the pregnancy. Owen knew he couldn't walk away again. He had to find her, to face her, to try to make things right. Tracking Avista down wasn't easy. She'd vanished from his world as thoroughly as a ghost, leaving no digital footprint. But Owen was nothing if not resourceful. He remembered fragments of their early conversations, her stories of summers spent with her grandmother in a small New Mexico village. A few discreet inquiries, a hired investigator, and a week of sleepless nights led him to Taos, to a dusty cluster of adobe homes nestled at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Avista was living there under a new name, Elena Ruiz. The realization stung. She'd erased him from her identity as surely as he'd tried to erase their child. Owen arrived in Taos on a crisp morning, his rented car out of place among the weathered pickups and bicycles. He found the house easily enough, a modest adobe, with a sagging wooden porch, its yard dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers. His heart pounded as he approached, his tailored coat and polished shoes absurdly formal in this quiet place. Before he could knock, the door swung open and a woman stood before him, her silver hair braided tightly, her eyes sharp as flint. Avista's grandmother, Rosa, sized him up with a look that could curdle milk. "You're the one who hurt her," she said, her voice low and cutting. "What do you want?" Owen swallowed, his usual confidence faltering. "I need to see Avista Elena. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to make things right." Rosa's gaze didn't soften. "Words are cheap, city boy. You think you can waltz in here after what you did? She's building a life without you. Give me one reason not to send you packing." He hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice raw. "I thought I was protecting something bigger, but I lost what mattered most. I'm not here to make promises I can't keep. I just want a chance to prove I've changed." Rosa studied him, her eyes narrowing. "No promises, no grand gestures. You want to prove something? Do the work. Show up not with money or charm, but with action. Otherwise, you're nothing but noise." She stepped aside, letting him in, but her warning lingered like a blade. Inside the house was warm, filled with the scent of cedar and chili simmering on the stove. Avista wasn't there. She was at her apartment, Rosa said, working on her startup. Owen wanted to go to her, but Rosa stopped him. "You don't get to barge into her life. You start here with me. Earn your place." It was a test, and Owen for once didn't argue. He stayed. The next day he returned, leaving behind a critical merger meeting in New York. His team was frantic, flooding his phone with messages, but Owen silenced it. He showed up at Rosa's with a toolbox, offering to fix the leaky faucet she'd mentioned. She watched him like a hawk, her skepticism palpable, but she let him work. The faucet was just the start. Over the next weeks, Owen became a fixture in the village, doing whatever was needed, chopping firewood, repairing fences, carrying groceries for Rosa. He traded his suits for jeans and a flannel shirt, his hands blistered from tasks he'd never done in his Manhattan life. The villagers whispered about the city man who'd appeared out of nowhere, but Rosa's approval, however grudging, kept their questions at bay. Avista knew he was there. Rosa had told her, and though she didn't seek him out, she didn't send him away. Owen caught glimpses of her walking to her apartment, meeting with clients at the cafe, but he kept his distance, respecting her space. He learned about her life as Elena Ruiz, about Soul Digital, her small but growing marketing startup. He admired her resilience, the way she'd built something from nothing. But he knew admiration wasn't enough. He had to earn her trust, not with words, but with actions, just as Rosa had demanded. When Avista's pregnancy advanced, Owen's role shifted. Rosa, softening slightly, allowed him to help more directly. He drove Avista to midwife appointments, waiting in the car to give her privacy. He brought her meals when she was too tired to cook simple things, like soup or bread he'd learned to make, under Rosa's watchful eye. Avista accepted his help with a guarded nod, her eyes wary, but not hostile. Yeah. She didn't speak of the past, and neither did he. The weight of their history hung between them, unspoken but ever present. When Avista went into labor, Owen was there. Rosa called him in the early hours, her voice urgent but calm. He arrived at the small clinic, his heart racing, and waited in the hallway as Avista brought their child into the world. Hours later, Rosa emerged, her face softer than he'd ever seen. "It's a girl," she said, and let him in. Avista was exhausted, her hair damp with sweat, but she held a tiny bundle in her arms. Owen stood frozen, his throat tight, until Avista met his gaze. "You can hold her," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He took the baby, her warmth against his chest, undoing him. She was real perfect, with Avista's dark eyes and a tiny fist curled against his shirt. Tears stung his eyes, the first he'd shed in years. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, not to the child, but to Avista, though he couldn't meet her gaze. She didn't respond, but she didn't turn away. Owen stayed in Taos, his life in New York a distant memory. He missed meetings, ignored emails, let his empire falter. None of it mattered. He helped Rosa with chores, sat with Avista during late-night feedings, learned the rhythm of a life he'd never imagined. The villagers began to accept him not as Owen Carter, CEO, but as the man who showed up day after day to prove himself. Rosa watched, her skepticism giving way to cautious respect. "You're learning," she said one evening, handing him a cup of coffee. It wasn't approval, not yet, but it was enough. Owen knew he had a long road ahead. Avista's trust was a fragile thing, and he'd shattered it once. But as he sat on Rosa's porch, watching the desert sky burn with stars, he felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. He wasn't here to win Avista back, not yet. He was here to be the man he should have been, the one who stayed, who acted, who loved without calculation. Owen Carter had shed the skin of the polished CEO, trading his tailored suits for worn jeans and a flannel shirt that smelled faintly of sagebrush. In the small Taos village, he was no longer the titan of Nexus Technologies, but a man trying to rebuild what he'd broken. Avista, now Elena Ruiz in this new life, had allowed him to stay not out of forgiveness, but out of necessity. Their newborn daughter, Lila, was a fragile bridge between them, a reason for Owen to remain, despite the chasm of their past. Rosa, Avista's sharp-eyed grandmother, watched his every move, her approval grudging but growing. "You're here," she'd said one evening, her tone still wary. "That's a start, but it's not enough." Owen understood. Words had failed him with Avista, his cold demands, his calculated promises. If he wanted to prove he'd changed, it would take actions, not apologies. He began small, respecting the boundaries Avista had set. She was guarded, her dark eyes carrying the weight of his betrayal, but she didn't send him away. That was enough for Owen to keep going, to show up day after day in the dusty village that had become his unlikely redemption. Avista's startup, Soul Digital, was her lifeline, a small but thriving digital marketing venture that served local businesses in Taos. Owen saw its potential, not as a corporate giant, but as a reflection of Avista's resilience. He didn't offer to take over or throw money at it, tactics of the old Owen, the one who'd seen her as an asset. Instead, he asked questions, listened to her plans, and offered help in ways that didn't overshadow her. "I know some people in tech who could use your services," he said one afternoon sitting on Rosa's porch while Lila slept inside. "No pressure. Just let me know if you want me to make a call." Avista studied him, her expression unreadable. "I don't need favors," she said, her voice firm, but not unkind. "Soul's doing fine on its own." "I know," Owen replied, careful not to push. "But you're building something real here. If I can help, I will. Not to control it, just to support you." She didn't respond, but a week later she handed him a list of potential clients, small businesses in Santa Fe and Albuquerque that could benefit from her expertise. Owen didn't gloat or overpromise. He reached out to his network, carefully selecting contacts who valued authenticity over flash. A sustainable fashion brand, a family-owned bookstore, a community center looking to expand its outreach. They were a far cry from Nexus's corporate clients, but Owen made the introductions with the same precision he'd once reserved for billion-dollar deals. He didn't ask for credit, didn't mention his name when the contracts came through. Avista noticed, though she said nothing. Soul Digital grew steadily, its client base expanding beyond Taos. Avista hired a part-time assistant, a local woman with a knack for graphic design, and rented a small office above the bookstore where she lived. Owen offered to review her business plan, not as a boss, but as a sounding board. He sat at her kitchen table, Lila napping in a bassinet nearby, and listened as Avista outlined her vision: affordable marketing for small businesses with a focus on community and sustainability. "You're good at this," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "You're making a difference." Avista's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "I'm doing it for me," she said, "and for Lila." Owen nodded, accepting the boundary. He knew her trust was a fragile thing, scarred by his past demands. He focused on the small things: bringing coffee to her office, fixing a wobbly chair, driving her to the market when her car broke down. He didn't ask for forgiveness or push for reconciliation. He simply showed up day after day, letting his actions speak where his words had failed. Beyond helping with Soul Digital, Owen used his influence to protect Avista's new life. A reporter from a tech blog sniffed around Taos, chasing rumors about the missing Avista Carter. Owen intercepted the inquiry, calling in favors to quash the story before it could take root. He didn't tell Avista, knowing she'd hate the idea of him pulling strings. But he couldn't risk her peace, not when she'd fought so hard for it. He worked quietly, redirecting attention to Nexus's latest initiatives, keeping the spotlight off Taos. When a local business owner mentioned a competitor trying to undercut Soul Digital's prices, Owen offered discreet advice on negotiation tactics, helping Avista secure her clients without ever stepping into the foreground. Avista noticed the changes in him. The Owen she'd known in New York was a man of grand gestures, always calculating the optics. This Owen was quieter, humbler. He listened more than he spoke, his hands rough from chores, his eyes softer when he looked at Lila. One evening, as they sat on Rosa's porch, Lila cradled in Avista's arms, Owen told a story about fixing a fence with Rosa, mimicking her sharp instructions with a rare laugh. Avista caught herself smiling, a reflex that surprised her. But the scars of his betrayal, his demand to end their child's life, still lingered. She couldn't let go, not yet. "You don't have to trust me," Owen said one night, as they washed dishes in Rosa's cramped kitchen. "I know I broke something that might never heal. But I'm here, Avista. For you, for Lila. As long as you'll let me stay." She dried her hands, her gaze fixed on the sink. "I see what you're doing," she said softly. "The work, the help. It's not nothing, but it doesn't erase what happened." "I know," he said, his voice low. "I'm not asking it to." Their conversations were cautious, laced with the weight of their past. Avista kept her distance, her heart guarded by the memory of Owen's cold words. But she couldn't deny his effort. He was there when Lila woke crying at dawn, rocking her gently so Avista could sleep. He was there when Sol Digital landed a big contract offering a quiet, "I'm proud of you," that felt genuine. Rosa, ever watchful, began to soften, inviting Owen to dinner, her sharp tongue tempered by his persistence. "He's trying," she told Avista one night. "More than I expected." Avista didn't know how to feel. The man she'd loved had broken her. But this man, this Owen, was different. Not perfect, not redeemed, but present. She watched him with Lila, the way he sang off-key lullabies, the way his face lit up when she grabbed his finger. It stirred something in her, a flicker of hope she wasn't ready to name. But the scars ran deep, and trust was a slow, fragile thing. For now, she let him stay, let him help, let his actions build a bridge she wasn't sure she'd cross. As winter settled over Taos, Owen stood outside Avista's office, watching her through the window as she worked. Lila was with Rosa, and the village was quiet, the sky a deep indigo. He didn't know if Avista would ever forgive him, but he knew he'd keep trying, not for absolution, but for her, for their daughter, for the man he wanted to be. His actions, small and steady, were his only language now, and he hoped in time they'd be enough. The rain came in sheets, drumming against the adobe walls of Taos, as a late spring storm swept through the desert. Avista, now living as Elena Ruiz, felt the first sharp pang of labor just after midnight. The pain was sudden, fierce, pulling her from a restless sleep in her small apartment above the bookstore. She lay still for a moment, hand on her swollen belly, breathing through the contraction as the reality settled in. Her daughter was coming. The world outside was a blur of water and wind, but inside, Avista's focus narrowed to the life she'd fought to protect, the child she'd chosen over Owen Carter's ambitions. She called Rosa her grandmother, whose voice was calm but urgent over the phone. "I'm coming, mija. Stay strong." Avista packed a small bag, her movements deliberate despite the growing pain. She didn't call Owen, but Rosa did. Her decision, a quiet acknowledgement of the man he'd been trying to become. Owen had been in Taos for months, proving himself through actions, fixing fences, helping with Avista's startup, showing up for the small moments without demanding forgiveness. Rosa, ever skeptical, had seen enough to let him stay, and now, as Avista's labor began, she knew he deserved to be there. Owen arrived at the small Taos clinic minutes after Rosa, his hair damp from the rain, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. The clinic was modest, its walls lined with faded posters about prenatal care, the air heavy with antiseptic, and the faint hum of a generator weathering the storm. Avista was already in a delivery room, her face etched with determination as another contraction hit. Owen hesitated at the door, his usual confidence replaced by a raw vulnerability. "Can I come in?" he asked Rosa, his voice barely above a whisper. Rosa studied him, her sharp gaze softened by the moment. "She hasn't said no," she replied. "But you respect her space. Understand?" He nodded, stepping inside. Avista lay on the narrow bed, her hands gripping the rails, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She met his gaze, her eyes fierce, but not unwelcoming. "You're here," she said, her voice strained but steady. It wasn't an invitation or a rejection, just a statement, and Owen took it as permission to stay. He moved to her side, his presence quiet but steady, and took her hand. Her grip was strong, almost bruising, as another contraction rolled through her. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, just held on, anchoring her through the pain. The labor stretched through the night, the storm outside a relentless backdrop. The midwife, a calm woman named Clara, guided Avista with gentle instructions, her hands steady as she monitored the baby's progress. Owen stayed by Avista's side, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, offering sips of water when she could manage them. He didn't try to fill the silence with promises or apologies. He'd learned that words meant little to her now. Instead, he focused on being present, his hand a constant in the chaos of labor. Avista didn't speak much, her energy consumed by the effort of bringing their child into the world, but she didn't push him away. As dawn approached, the rain eased to a soft drizzle, and Avista's labor reached its peak. Clara's voice grew firm, urging her to push. Avista's face contorted with effort, her breath ragged her hand, tightening around Owen's. He whispered encouragement, his voice low and steady. "You're doing this, Avista. You're so strong." She didn't respond, but her eyes flicked to his, a fleeting connection that held more weight than words. Finally, after one last wrenching push, the room filled with a new sound, a sharp, piercing cry. Clara lifted a tiny, wriggling form, her hands gentle as she wrapped the baby in a soft blanket. "It's a girl," she said, smiling. Avista exhaled, her body sagging with relief and exhaustion, tears streaming down her cheeks. Owen's breath caught his eyes fixed on the small bundle as Clara placed her in Avista's arms. The baby was perfect. Her tiny face scrunched, her fists curling against the blanket. Avista cradled her, a sob breaking free as she whispered, "Lila." Owen stood frozen, his heart pounding. He'd faced boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, but nothing had prepared him for this. The raw, overwhelming reality of his daughter. Clara nodded to him, and Avista, her gaze soft but guarded, said, "You can hold her." Her voice was quiet, not warm, but not cold. A door cracked open just enough for him to step through. He took Lila, his hands trembling as he cradled her small weight. She was warm, alive, a miracle he'd once tried to erase. Tears blurred his vision, and he looked at Avista, the woman he'd hurt, the woman who'd built a new life without him. "You're home," he said, his voice breaking. Not asset, as he'd once called her, in his calculated world, but home, the place he'd been searching for in the emptiness of his empire. The words slipped out unscripted, raw, and it hung in the air between them. Avista's eyes flickered, a storm of emotions passing through them. Pain, caution, maybe, a trace of something softer. She didn't respond, but she didn't look away. The weight of their past, his betrayal, was still there, a scar that hadn't healed. She'd carried Lila alone, defied his demands, rebuilt her life as Elena Ruiz. His presence now, his effort, didn't erase that. But as she watched him hold their daughter, his face softened in a way she'd never seen. She felt a shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but an opening, a chance for him to be something more than the man who'd broken her. "I'm not ready to trust you," she said finally, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "But Lila deserves a father. You can be that if you keep showing up." Owen knotted his throat tight. "I will," he said, and for the first time, it wasn't a promise born of strategy. It was a vow, simple and true. He looked down at Lila, her tiny chest rising and falling, and felt a purpose he'd never known in boardrooms or mergers. He'd lost Avista, once driven her away with his ambition. He wouldn't lose this chance. The storm had passed, and the clinic was quiet, the first light of dawn filtering through the window. Rosa stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes softened by tears. She didn't speak, but her nod to Owen was enough, an acknowledgement that he'd taken a step, however small, toward redemption. Avista rested, her body spent, but her spirit fierce. Lila nestled against her. Owen sat beside them, still holding Avista's hand. His presence a quiet promise to stay, to act, to be the father Lila deserved. The road ahead was uncertain. Avista's heart was still scarred, her trust, a fragile thing Owen would have to earn day by day. But in that moment with their daughter between them, Owen felt a spark of hope. He'd called Avista home, and though she wasn't ready to accept it, he'd spend every day proving he meant it, not with words, but with the life he was beginning to build in Taos. The Taos sun rose slowly, casting a golden glow over the adobe houses and sagebrush-dotted hills. Months had passed since Lila's birth, and Owen Carter had become a fixture in the small New Mexico village, his former life as a tech titan, fading like a distant memory. The man who once commanded boardrooms now spent his days in a simpler rhythm, waking at dawn to make coffee for Avista. Now Elena Ruiz, carrying Lila in a sling as he helped Rosa with chores and working quietly to support Avista's startup, Soul Digital. The desert had stripped him of his polish, leaving behind a man learning to live for something other than ambition. Owen's life in Taos was humble, a stark contrast to the Manhattan penthouse he'd left behind. He rented a small casita near Rosa's house, its walls bare except for a few photos of Lila, her first smile, her tiny hand gripping his finger. He'd sold most of his possessions, keeping only what fit in a single suitcase. Nexus Technologies was still his, but he'd delegated much of its operation to his team, ignoring their pleas for him to return. The scandals that had once consumed him were fading, handled by crisis managers he no longer micromanaged. His world now revolved around Avista and Lila, and the quiet work of proving himself worthy of them. Avista watched his transformation with cautious eyes. The Owen she'd known in New York, cold calculating a man who'd seen her as an asset, had been replaced by someone quieter, steadier. He showed up every day, not with grand gestures, but with small, consistent acts, fixing a leaky pipe in her office, bringing her favorite chamomile tea when she worked late, singing off-key lullabies to Lila until she giggled. He didn't push for forgiveness or demand a place in her life. He simply stayed his presence, a steady anchor in the chaos of new motherhood and her growing business. Soul Digital had flourished, thanks in part to Owen's discreet support. He'd connected Avista with clients across the Southwest, never taking credit, and offered advice on scaling her operations without overshadowing her vision. Avista's office was now a bustling space with 2 employees and a steady stream of projects. She'd built something real, something hers and Owen's respect for it softened her defenses. She began to see glimpses of the man she'd once loved, not the CEO, but the one who'd listened to her dreams in their early days, before ambition had consumed him. Lila was the heart of their fragile truce. The baby with her curious eyes and infectious laugh drew them together. Owen was a devoted father, learning to change diapers with clumsy hands, reading picture books in a voice that made Avista smile despite herself. One evening, as they sat on Rosa's porch, Lila asleep in Owen's arms, Avista caught herself laughing at his attempt to mimic a cartoon character. The sound surprised her, a reminder of a time when love had come easily. But the scars of his betrayal, his demand to end Lila's life, still lingered. Trust was a slow, delicate thing, and Avista wasn't ready to let go of her guard. Owen understood. He didn't ask for more than she could give. He focused on the present, on being the father Lila needed and the partner Avista deserved. He helped Rosa tend her garden, learned to cook her recipes, and became a quiet part of the village. Locals once wary of the city, stranger, began to nod in greeting, accepting him as Elena's partner, Lila's father. Rosa, whose sharp tongue had kept Owen on edge, softened over time, offering him coffee and stories of Avista's childhood. "You're not the man you were," she said one night, her eyes meeting his. "But you've got a long way to go." A year after Lila's birth, Owen knew he wanted to stay forever, not just in Taos, but with Avista and their daughter. He'd been working on something in secret, a project that took him to a local jeweler's workshop on quiet evenings. There, with calloused hands, he designed a ring, not the ostentatious diamond he'd given Avista in New York, but a simple band of silver and turquoise, etched with the words, "Only for love." It was a promise not of wealth or status, but of the life he wanted to build with her. One evening, as the desert sky burned with stars, Owen asked Avista to walk with him. They left Lila with Rosa and wandered to a clearing near the Rio Grande, the air cool and scented with piñon. Owen's heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady. "I know I broke something that might never fully heal," he said, his eyes on the horizon. "I don't deserve you, Avista, but I love you. Not as an asset, not as a strategy, but as my home. I want to stay to be Lila's father, to be your partner if you'll have me." He pulled the ring from his pocket, holding it out. "I made this for you," he said. "No diamonds, no flash. Just me promising to show up every day for you and Lila. Only for love." Avista's breath caught her eyes, tracing the ring's simple beauty. The words etched into it echoed in her heart, stirring memories of the pain he'd caused and the man he'd become. She didn't speak for a long moment, her fingers brushing the turquoise. "I haven't forgotten," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "What you did, what you asked of me, it's still there. But I see you now, Owen. The way you've stayed, the way you've changed. You're not the man who hurt me." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "I'm not saying yes because I've forgiven everything. I'm saying yes because you've earned a place in Lila's life, and maybe in time in mine. You've shown me you can stay." Owen's throat tightened, tears prickling his eyes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch gentle, reverent. They stood in silence, the river's soft rush the only sound, and for the first time, Owen felt whole, not as a CEO, but as a man who'd found his way back. They remarried in a quiet ceremony at Rosa's house, surrounded by a handful of villagers and the scent of sage. There were no cameras, no press, just vows spoken under a desert sky. Avista wore a simple dress, Owen a linen shirt, and Lila, toddling now, giggled in Rosa's arms. Their promises were simple, grounded in the lesson they'd both learned. Love was not in grand declarations, but in staying in, showing up, through the mess of life. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs. Owen and Avista lived in Taos, raising Lila in a world of dusty trails and warm adobe walls. Soul Digital grew a testament to Avista's strength, and Owen found purpose in supporting it, in being a father, in loving, without calculation. They were a new family, not perfect, but real, built on the truth that love is not a promise spoken, but a life shared, day by day, in the quiet beauty of staying.